The second point of this lesson about unwritten norms of international law is the general principles of law. General principles of law, they are announced by the Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice as subsidiary source of law. So general principles of law are subsidiary source of law, unwritten source of law, and subsidiary source of law, which means that a principle is used in case of need. And there we find the real definition of the concept of principle, not only in international law, but in every branch of law. A legal principle is an unwritten rule generally discovered by the judge during the interpretations of written rules. If a written rule is unclear, if a written rule is not sufficient to resolve the case, resolve the litigation, so the judge can refer to general principles of law in order to complete the written rule, in order to overcome of difficulties generated by the absence or unclearness of the written rule. So, when the rule is not clear, despite of rejecting the judgment, despite of refusing to judge, the jurisdiction will interpret and will find a principle of law which will help it to apply the law and to resolve the litigation. There are very different kinds of general principles also in international legal order. In international legal order, as well as the national law, is inspired, first of all, by, for example, basic principles of Roman law. We have, since centuries and centuries, the Roman law, and there, in Roman law, we know that there are several principles which are also today are applied not only in national legal orders, but also in international legal order. One example of these Roman principles for example, I will take the example of the ne bis in idem principle. Ne bis in idem principle. Ne bis in idem principle, which means the one cannot be judged more than one time for the same case, for the same subject. You cannot be judged two times or more than one time, for a thing for what you are already judged. It is the case in criminal law, ne bis in idem principle. It is also the case in international law. In the same litigation, there can be only one judgment. This is the example of Roman law, but there are another principles of Roman law which are substantial principles. For example, principles of interpretation, general principles of interpretations. It means that there are rules very well known, even though they are not written, but they are respected, they are applied. For example, we have one rule of interpretation, principle of interpretation, which is the narrow interpretation of exceptions. Narrow interpretation of exceptions. If there is a principle, if there is an exception, the exception must be interpreted narrowly, and the principle must be interpreted in a wide way, large way. So we have all of kinds of those principles inspired from Roman law, inspired from domestic laws, but which are applied also in international law. We have, for example, the principle pacta sunt servanda. The principle of pacta sunt servanda, which is a very substantial principle of international law, means that a state giving its word, contracting a treaty, must respect its word, must respect the treaty. States must respect treaties that they sign with others. So this is the pacta sunt servanda principle, which exists also in national contractual law. We know that if you make a contract, you have to respect this contract, pacta sunt servanda. And there are more specific principles of international law which exist even though they weren't always codified in a convention, in a treaty. We have, for example, the principle of equal state sovereignty, the principle of equal state sovereignty, which is also codified in several conventions, also in Charter of United Nations, but which has also a character of a principle, which means that it can be applied even though there is no binding convention in that time. This is the case of Nicaragua against United States. This is the case of ICG in 1986, Nicaragua against United States, the paramilitary activities case. In that case, ICG recognized the existence of this principle of equal state sovereignties. So the question is, what is the legal nature of general principle of law? Are they autonomous from customs? Are they different from customs? Which are the differences between customs and general principle of law? It's not only a theoretical question, it's also a very important question, because legal conditions of the creation of general principles are not the same as legal conditions of creation of customs. there is no opinio juris psychological condition, and also there is no the condition of repetition, repeated behavior. So there is a real confusion. There can be a real confusion because general principles are also discovered by the case law, by the judge. So the judge will decide if a rule is a custom or if a rule is a general principle. And it's also difficult. The distinction is also difficult, even though it's necessary, because legal conditions are not the same. Customs are very difficult to create. General principles are discovered by the judge, by the interpretation of the written rules. The confusion can be also possible because, as international customs, international principles also they can be codified by international conventions. So when you look at United Nations Charter, you see those principles codified. Principle of non-interference, principle of equality of sovereignty, for example. Another difficulty of the convention, the definition, the identification of the unwritten rules, the difficulty between the qualification of principle, the qualification of custom, is that there is a third qualification, there is a third concept, which is the concept of jus cogens. Jus cogens means mandatory rule of international law, which is not really defined. There is a definition in Vienna Convention of 1996, but this definition is very unclear also. This definition is very wide, very obscure. Read this definition in Article 53 of Vienna Convention of 1969. The jus cogens rule is defined as a peremptory norm of general international law accepted and recognized by the international community of states as a whole, as a norm from which no derogation is permitted and which can be modified only by a jus cogens norm. So I repeat the important passage. The jus cogens is a peremptory norm of general international law accepted and recognized by the international community of states as a whole, as a norm from which no derogation is permitted and which can be modified only by another jus cogens norm. So neither a convention, a principle cannot be in conflict with jus cogens. So jus cogens is another concept. So we have lots of concepts, unwritten norms in international law. We have customs, we have general principles, and we have jus cogens. So how can we distinguish them? Jus cogens are very rare. Until today, there is only one jus cogens rule which is announced, and this is the prohibition of the genocide. only the prohibition of the genocide is considered as a jus cogens rule. So the difference between custom principle and jus cogens is that jus cogens is very, very rare. The last point, the third point of this lesson about unwritten rules will be the three other categories which are gathered as international jurisprudence, doctrine, and equity. International jurisprudence, doctrine, and equity are also subsidiary means for the determination of rules of law. According to Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, which is listing different kinds of sources, legal sources of international law. So we can make a difference. There are primary norms, which are written rules, treaties, conventions, customs, jus cogens, general principles. They are very important. And subsidiary, secondary, jurisprudence, doctrine, and equity. I told you, of course, principles are subsidiary regarding to written rules, but jurisprudence, doctrine, and equity are more subsidiary than principles, as you can understand like that. But there is also a difficulty because customs, jus cogens, principles must be identified, qualified by the jurisprudence, by the case law. Decisions, case law, what is jurisprudence? The jurisprudence is a case law, is the norm in a form of case law, which means a judicial decision rendered by a jurisdiction. There can be decisions which have the legal authority between a demander and a defender, and there can be advisory opinions which are also important for the interpretation of the international law. There are a lot of jurisdictions. We have the ICJ, International Court of Justice, the CJEU, the Court of Justice of European Union, the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights. We have also arbitral tribunals. We have other organs like Inter-American Court of Human Rights. We have appellate body of WTO or Tribunal of International Labor Organization. So we have a lot of international jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions are publishing their case law, and the interpretation of international law principles, international law norms depend by those case law rendered by international jurisdictions. Doctrine, the second subsidiary source, is the doctrine, and doctrine, it can be defined as the teaching of most qualified legal writers, legal authors, legal academics in every nation. And they have also an influence because, for example, some conventions are prepared, are elaborated as drafts, projects by those doctrine. So doctrine is also important. And when you read case law, you see also that international jurisdictions are referring to those international doctrine in order to interpret international norms. The last norm, unwritten norm, subsidiary, is equity. But there is an important remark about the equity. Um, do not confuse equity in international law and equity in American or British law. In United Kingdom, for example, equity is a branch of domestic law. Common law and equity are a corpus of bills and decisions, so it's a branch of law. In contrast, in international law, equity refers to social, moral, ethical, cultural, um, non-judicial considerations. In Turkish, we call it hakkaniyet. Equity is hakkaniyet. It's an autonomous source of law. It can be used if no treaty, no custom, no principle, no jurisprudence exist in the matter. If there is a difficulty to resolve the case, the judge can use equity. For example, ICJ can decide exequo bono. It means it can decide by referring to moral considerations. This is the case, for example, it was the case, for example, in 1969 in the continental shelf decision. The ICJ, as there was no custom, no obligatory rule, the ICJ invited different states to resolve their maritime delimitation by equitable principles for the limitation of the continental shelf between Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany. So this is all I wanted to tell you about unwritten norms in international legal order. Thank you for your presence, and see you next week at the classroom. Thank you very much.